Welcome to Honors 190, Life in China Beyond Headlines. In this class, taught by Dr. John Kennedy, we learned about the various important aspects of China. We will discuss the household registration system and reform, education and employment, and rural and urban migration. The household registration system determines if an individual lives in an urban area or a rural area. These two areas provide different standards of living, as urban residents have an abundance of resources compared to rural residents. Therefore, rural residents face many challenges in obtaining education and employment opportunities. In an attempt to obtain a more successful future, rural residents will try to move to urban areas. The migration from rural to urban areas leads to many reformations made by the Chinese government. The following slides will provide more information about each section.
Our group will be presenting about the household registration, or hukou system, and how it relates to urban and rural migration in China. The hukou system was created in 1958 and was initially a way for the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, to restrict the number of rural migrants who were moving to the city. This was done by creating two types of hukous: rural hukous for those in the countryside and rural areas, and urban hukous for those in cities or urban centers. This was for a number of reasons. Maintaining the rural-urban divide was a major one, as was keeping rural farmers who were producing many of the agricultural products fueling China's rapid urban and industrial growth during this time. It's for these reasons that the hukou system was intentionally made in such a way as to make it as difficult as possible for households to obtain a registration card for the city they wanted to migrate to. A household registration card, as seen in the picture, is essential to life in China. It's needed for any task that one would need to advance their life, such as having a house, going to school, or getting a job. Without a household registration card, a person simply cannot get what they need to be able to live in the city. It's also quite difficult to change the status of a household registration or to get a new one for a different location. Both of these owe to why the hukou system is so effective at limiting migration. Rural citizens are at a great disadvantage in many ways. Schools are worse, resources are limited, and it's immensely difficult for rural citizens to move from the country and into cities for work. The hukou stops many rural Chinese from attaining a better life. Education, one of the main ways for someone to escape rural China, is made difficult. For those who want to go to the cities for their better schools, a special migrant registration card is needed, and, like many other aspects of the hukou system, it's very difficult to get. On the other hand, the hukou does generally prevent massive slums from forming around cities. It's for this reason that China's urban centers, unlike those found in India or Brazil, for example, don't have these massive slums, which are generally overcrowded and have deplorable conditions. As alluded to previously, the hukou system was initially established under Mao Zedong, pictured here on the left, to limit the movement from rural to urban China. This system was largely maintained until 1976, when Mao died and Deng Xiaoping, pictured on the right, came to power. Deng was much more reform-minded than Mao before him and began to apply this reformist mindset to China as a whole. We see this beginning in 1978 as the first wave of economic reforms take hold in China. Alongside this were minor changes to the hukou system. These were mostly limited to individual cities or towns, but included things like temporary residency programs, which allowed rural individuals to work in cities, but not access to government services like hospitals. 1994 marks the first of what has become a number of serious discussions regarding hukou reform. Changes during this time include stopping the practice of sending unregistered rural migrants back to the countryside. Finally, in recent years, we have seen greater efforts to reform the hukou system. Both local governments and the CCP have made serious efforts to bridge the divide between rural and urban hukou, and these efforts are expected to continue into the near future. On one hand, some have called for reform of the hukou system. Its numerous criticisms and complaints have resulted in many people advocating for a complete abolishment of the system. As a result, the government has been pushing out various reforms in hopes of improving the structure. Some changes include a national relaxation of limits on migration to small towns and cities, moving towards streamlining hukou registration in provinces and large cities, and other individual local reforms. Most of these adjustments aim to eradicate certain hukou categories. Though migrants still need to meet a locally set criteria, the reforms have made it easier for a rural citizen to apply for an urban hukou. There is a sense that there are fewer restrictions and more freedom. Despite the negative analysis of the hukou by many, the system has its perks and benefits. A call for continued reform could be a better plan than the complete removal of the hukou. China has loosened restrictions on the hukou system, resulting in more free migration across the country. These multitudes of workers have had a very positive impact on China's economic growth. Possibly the hukou system needs more time. More reforms will allow populated, urban areas the resources and time to invest and develop. The removal of the hukou may result in the overcrowding and flooding of crucial social services like schools, hospitals, and police stations. Some places are just not well prepared yet to deal with a sudden influx of citizens. Cities and provinces would be overwhelmed to the point where local PSB offices and services would be put under huge amounts of stress. On the other hand, there is also debate on whether or not the hukou system should be completely abolished. Those that believe the system should be abolished believe that the existence of the system institutionalized inequalities between rural and urban residents and consolidates the government's administrative control over the population. Professor Kennedy witnessed this impact of the hukou system firsthand, and here are some pictures to demonstrate rural residents being left behind because of the inherent flaws in the system. The benefits of ending the system are threefold. First, they will address unequal access to education, healthcare, and more. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that lowering the bar to home ownership and making it just as easy for a rural resident to move somewhere as an urban resident will allow equal access to government services. Second, ending the system will change the rural second class citizenship. In the status quo, rural residents are perceived as inferior. They are blamed for high crime rates, and they experience discriminatory practices. Getting rid of that system will change the way those residents are viewed in the domestic sphere. Third, reforms have not been effective. For example, the government began to allow citizens to replace rural hukou for urban ones, but this has only resulted in rural migrants being pushed to smaller cities that have yet to reach full economic and infrastructural development, and thus are still far behind rural residents.
We are going to discuss education and employment in China. We are going to start off with talking about education. There are drastic differences between the learning conditions in rural areas compared to those in urban areas. Rural areas receive less funding from the government, thus, the conditions of the schools are worse off. Also, the students in rural areas generally receive less opportunities. On the other hand, people who live in urban areas usually have a higher income, therefore, they have the ability to give their kids more opportunities to learn, such as getting a tutor or purchasing more study materials. These factors are crucial in determining how a student performs on the college entrance exam. The college entrance exam in China is also called the Gaokao. It is a test that lasts for 2 or 3 days. The score that the students receive is very important as it determines the future of these students. It determines what colleges that the students can go to and in turn what job opportunities they can receive. The college entrance exam is a way for students in rural areas to change their lives for the better as it gives them an opportunity to secure a successful future. Not only do the students have a pressure to do well from themselves, they also receive pressure from their families. If they receive a bad score on the test, it will lead to shame and embarrassment to the family, whereas if the student earns a good score, they will bring pride to their families.
Though some individuals migrate from rural to urban areas permanently, there is a great amount of temporary migration that can be seen throughout China, and education has a significant effect on this trend. As stated previously, the Gaokao gives students that come from lower income backgrounds, typically found in many rural areas, an opportunity to succeed in the modern urban China. However, there exists a great disparity in the scores required to enter top universities. Students who live in the general region surrounding these universities, such as Beijing for Tsinghua University, Hangzhou for Zhejiang University, and so on for other prestigious institutions, do not need as high of a score to get in as those in rural areas. Thus, students in rural communities must either work that much harder to achieve admissions into these universities, or they must travel to these regions in an attempt to boost the students' chances of achieving higher education. Once these families reach the cities, however, the question arises: do the academic opportunities available to them merit the migration? Education in China, as described previously, is both a gateway to fiscal success as well as social success. Thus, families will often pour a great deal of their life towards the success of their children, so long as they have the means to do so. One such way that this is achieved is through what is known as shadow education, which is the name for the extra tutoring and study materials referenced before. Beyond the schools attended in the urban areas possibly providing a better general education, the extra steps that are often used by the urban citizens cannot be taken by the rural migrants due to the existing divide between the rural migrants and urban citizens. The pressure then largely falls on the students. After all of the work, some students still do not make the cut to attend their preferred university. In rural Sichuan province, only 10.70% of students go to their first choice. In Shanxi, a similarly low 9.93% of students get their first choice as well. However, in urban Hebei and Tianjin, 15.86% and 24.05% of students get their first choice university. As can be seen, students who live in rural areas are not completely unable to attain admission into higher education, but the rates at which students in the urban areas are entices the migration to these areas from rural communities in hopes of better chances of admission.
In the next section, we will discuss the employment opportunities in China.
As mentioned previously, there is a big rural to urban education gap in China, and this gap has a major effect on employment for both rural and urban residents. As can be seen in this survey conducted in 2017, significantly more urban residents, about 59% in comparison to 13% in rural areas, have a college degree, and therefore have better access to opportunities at the university level and then later on in their respective job sectors or fields. In addition, even though many rural residents have ways to increase their wealth by going to vocational school or simply graduating junior high school and then going straight to work, both wealth and class gaps are still quite big in China. And by limiting educational resources for rural students, such as requiring higher Gaokao scores for university entrances, these gaps will only continue to grow wider. As well, this gap is exacerbated by the fact that significantly more people in rural areas only have a compulsory education, with rates being 40% in rural areas and only 14% in urban areas. The significant lack of education in rural populations contributes significantly to the demographic of migrant workers and blue-collar workers such as factory workers or small shop owners.
There are more than 200 million rural to urban migrants that are working in cities in China. The majority of these migrants are relatively young, many even being under the age of 18. The primary motivation behind urban migration are the employment opportunities. Many students feel as if school is a waste due to the schooling system that can make it harder for rural students to succeed. The uncertainty of academic investment, combined with the opportunities and the excitement the cities provide, attracts many of them away from their rural hometowns. Many of these rural students quit school after the compulsory 9 years and migrate to cities where they are able to attend training schools, which help them funnel directly into manufacturing, construction, or retail jobs. Though migrant workers often see an increase in wealth after moving to cities, there is still a huge inequality between them and other Chinese citizens living in those cities. Unfortunately, many migrant workers suffer from heavy pressure from work, low wages, and overall lesser satisfaction with life.
We will now move on to talking about urbanization and urban villages in China.
First, we will discuss urbanization, the movement of people from rural to urban China. Just 40 years ago, less than 20% of the population lived within cities. Today, that number is around 60%, or a little over 800 million people in urbanized areas. For a frame of reference, in a Yale study in 2013, that 60% number was supposed to be hit around 2030. We've obviously drastically beat that, showing just how unprecedented these numbers are. Current estimates are that by 2035, around 70% of the population will be urbanized, and for another scale, 25 out of the 100 of the world's most populous cities all belong to China. This drastic urbanization has done incredible things, revolutionizing the entire Chinese economy. The poverty alleviation program started by Xi Jinping in 2013 have currently lifted about 700 million people out of poverty by focusing on poor rural areas, bringing them out of these rural areas, giving them industrialized jobs in the cities. Mega cities such as Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen have economies similar to high-income countries such as those found in Europe. For this image below, I want you to look at the difference you see across the water. In 1990, there's trees and grass and greenery. In 2010, it is a fully industrialized full city. That's only 20 years difference.
A large component of urbanization is the push factors from the origin, rural China, and the pull factors to the destination, Chinese urban areas and villages. Much of rural China is poor, and there is a lack of good paying jobs to support families. Migrants want to leave this difficult and taxing lifestyle behind and move into the cities for increased opportunities. Better jobs with higher paying wages can be found in cities, and there's also the possibility to change to hukou for the family. Additionally, younger people might move for better education. Even though there are sacrifices for moving, many people think the positives outweigh them. As the picture shows, there's an eastern migration trend from rural China to the cities on the coast. The privatization of companies also attracts people to the cities. There is an increase in the construction of high rises as opposed to work unit housing. This difference can be seen in the foreground and the background of the photos. Here's an example of work unit housing, and then in the background, here are the high rises.
We will now move on to what exactly are urban villages and what it's like to live in one. The history of urban villages. China saw an increase in urban population around the 1970s. This has roots with the changing of the household registration system in the 1950s set by the Chinese government. With the rise of urban residents, new challenges emerged, such as housing these newcomers and the government's usage of former rural lands for urbanization. From these challenges appeared a need to house rural migrants in these new urban areas. There is an important distinction needed to be made with the term rural migrant. There is the original villager, wherein the village turns into an urban district, thus, the rural resident into an urban resident. The more traditional image of a migrant is an individual who came or comes to a city to find a better lifestyle and potential opportunities for their families and their future. Function of urban villages. Landowners build multi-story buildings for those who cannot afford better housing. However, these buildings are not regulated by the government, often leading to heavy population and higher than average building density. Alongside this exists a precedent for a lack of infrastructure within these buildings. These particular areas serve as cheap accommodations for those looking to make a living in the city.
Inside urban villages, a major income for villagers is rent. Original villagers, migrant workers, and those seeking lower rent live there. Every urban village is different, but usually villages have their own restaurants, police, public showers, garbage disposal, entertainment, and education. They are not subject to city zoning laws. If you decide to live there, expect poor sanitary conditions, crowded spaces, and few to no amenities. Also, people will look down on you because you are of a lower class. Brazil has massive urban slums that surround their cities, but China's urban villages aren't massive and they only take up pockets of space inside the cities. When compared to favelas of Brazil, China's urban villages are smaller in size. Favelas are larger, so they naturally have higher crime rates. Both places have few similarities. Both are areas for low income people, both are crowded with narrow alleys, both have businesses with homes above them and aren't as developed as other areas.
This is the conclusion to our presentation. Thank you for watching and listening.